Hi, everyone. I first just want to say thank you so much again to the conference organizers, Biz, Justine, and Cecilia, for all the work you've done in putting this together. Yesterday was such a great day, and I'm excited to jump in for our second group of panels. My name is Laura Curren. I am a PhD candidate in clinical psychology at Boston University. My research and clinical work relate to the development and implementation of treatments for anxiety, depression, and traumatic stress. So as Justine said, I'll be serving as discussant for the current panel, Trauma and its Impact on Human Behaviors. We have three excellent panelists who are here to speak on this topic. I'll have each of them introduce themselves, but joining us today are Drs. Andrew Rasmussen, Brian Marx, and Patrick Vinck. Thank you all for being here today. So now I'll first turn it over to Dr. Marx for his opening talk.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for having me. It's really a pleasure to be here. I have prepared a few slides that I will share here. So let's see. Okay, all right. Well, thank you again very much for having me. It's really a pleasure to be here and to talk with you all about a topic that is obviously very important and relevant, especially in today's day of COVID and George Floyd and everything else that we have going on in the world. I know that there is a range of folks with experience and expertise with trauma and its impact. And so what I thought I would do is just talk very, very briefly just about PTSD and trauma, just to sort of get everybody on the same footing. PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, is rather unique to our diagnostic classification scheme in that, in part, it is defined by the fact that symptoms are related to an event, and that event is what we refer to typically as a traumatic experience. Now, we could spend hours talking about what trauma is. The fact of the matter is that it's a bit of a moving target. The definition of trauma has changed over time. I'm sure it will continue to change as we think about things that are happening in our cultural background at the moment. But for our purposes here, the definition of trauma as it is in the DSM-5 is the following. The person was exposed to death, threatened death, actual or threatened serious injury, or actual or threatened sexual violence in one of the following ways. Direct exposure, witnessing the event happening to somebody else, learning that a relative or close friend was exposed to a trauma, or indirect exposure to aversive details of the trauma, usually in the course of professional duties. That last piece, usually in the course of professional duties, was specifically included in the most recent version of the DSM-5 in order to kind of differentiate people who may have seen things on the news, on the TV, things, watching, let's say, like the events that unfolded on 9/11, but actually not being in New York or in Washington, D.C., and so on when the events occurred. So that is the definition as it currently is constituted. But like I said, it's a bit of a moving target. Criterion A, the traumatic stressor, is just one of a number of diagnostic criteria for PTSD. As I mentioned, there is the stressor criterion, which I just defined. And then there are several other criteria, each of which have various signs and symptoms included in them. And I'll just go through them very quickly here. Intrusions are things like nightmares, intrusive thoughts. Avoidance, the avoidance criteria are things like avoidance of reminders of the event. Negative alterations in cognition or mood are having difficulty with positive emotions, not being able to get close to other people, psychogenic amnesia. The arousal and reactivity criterion are things like exaggerated startle or difficulty sleeping. And there are 20 symptoms in the PTSD diagnostic set in total. The symptoms need to be present for at least 1 month since the event. The symptoms need to result in either clinically significant distress or impairment in either social or occupational functioning in order to be recognized as a disorder. And the symptoms cannot be attributable to effects of substances or another medical condition. If we had more time, I would unpack a lot of this, but this just gives you a sense of what the diagnostic criteria are for PTSD. Trauma exposure is actually quite prevalent. I'm sure most of us who are on this call or on this Zoom meeting have experienced some type of trauma in your lives. I know I have. But what is interesting is that being exposed to trauma doesn't automatically mean that you will develop PTSD. And there's been a lot of data to suggest that at a population level, PTSD, while actually quite prevalent as far as psychiatric disorders are concerned, occur within a small percentage or a small slice of the population. Now, if you look at segments of the populations, for example, active duty service members, veterans, the prevalence of PTSD is actually much higher. In veterans, it might be as much as 20% or 25%. It also depends on the trauma exposure that you're exposed to. For example, sexual assault survivors have a much higher prevalence of PTSD than other kinds of trauma survivors. And of course, it ranges, the prevalence ranges based on age and sex and other kinds of demographic factors. So that is all to say that variability is the rule, not the exception here, that you could have two different people experience the same trauma, perhaps even at the same time, and you would have different outcomes. One might develop PTSD, the other might not. And there are a variety of reasons for that. There are numerous risk factors that make some people more vulnerable to PTSD than others. We have pre-trauma exposure factors, peri-traumatic exposure factors, and post-traumatic exposure factors, things like social support and someone's emotional response at the time of the trauma are factors that we know pose the highest risk. So folks who don't have good social support, those are people who are more likely to develop PTSD than others. Folks who experience intense fear or helplessness at the time of the event, or they dissociate, meaning they become less aware of their surroundings during the event. These are very potent risk factors for developing PTSD. And there are various trajectories that people can take in the wake of trauma. Some don't exhibit any symptoms. Some immediately exhibit symptoms that don't change and they remain quite severe. Some recover over time. And there are even some who have no symptoms initially, but over time may develop symptoms. And there are 20 symptoms, as I mentioned to you. You need symptoms in a certain configuration in order to be diagnosed with PTSD. But because there are 20 symptoms, what that means is there are over 600,000 different ways, different permutations of the diagnosis. So there's a heterogeneity is really the rule for how people present their symptoms. And PTSD does not occur in a vacuum. There's often the case that PTSD co-occurs with things like depression and substance use and traumatic brain injury. So there are varieties in that regard as well. And people really vary in their treatment response too. We have very good treatments for PTSD, but they don't work for everybody. And that is something that is very important in the field and that we're still trying to unravel and understand why some people get better and why others do not. The work that I do has really been focused on the assessment and treatment of PTSD. And certainly we do that from a very controlled scientific perspective, but obviously the idea is to take what we learn from our research and then be able to translate that work so that folks, as I mentioned to you, trauma exposure is very pervasive. There's a high need for the treatments that we have. but they're not always readily accessible. And so we have to really make our treatments much more accessible and translate them for the field to be used widely. I don't know if some of you have seen, there was a recent study that was published and it was picked up in the news that there was a therapy psychotherapy that was assisted by MDMA. And what we found, or what the folks who ran that study found, was that that therapy was effective for 2/3 of the people who received it, which is really great news. But what I will say is it is a very labor-intensive, time-intensive therapy that requires a lot of resources. It is not something that can be easily translated into the field. And so while, you know, the study is interesting and it offers another treatment option, there are questions about how we can really roll this out and make this widely accessible and available for folks. Service members and veterans don't do as well as others when it comes to treatment response, and implementation of our treatments with fidelity to the treatment protocols is still a concern. Of course, we want to pay attention to diversity of the samples and make sure that the findings of our studies are generalizable, not just to a very homogeneous group, not just all men, but certainly we want women and we want people of color in our samples and various other folks, in order to make sure that we are our treatments are found to be efficacious for everybody as much as possible. And I'll just end here by just saying that as I mentioned earlier, it's a mystery as to why some folks are more responsive to treatment than others. And we are actively exploring what these factors or moderators of treatment outcome are. And this is work that is really just starting now in the field and hopefully will yield important results. So thank you. I will stop there.
Thank you so much, Dr. Marx. I'm very interested in the questions you raised, in particular about variability in both emotional responses to trauma and also in its very definition, which brings up a certain degree of methodological complexity in our research design and clinical service delivery. You also spoke to the importance of and certain challenges related to the translation and dissemination of clinical research to real-world and fieldwork settings. So I'm looking forward to hearing more about some of these considerations during the discussion period. But for now, I will turn it over to Dr. Rasmussen for his remarks. Thanks.
Welcome. Well, thank you very much. I'm going to have some slides here. Anyone see those slides set up? Okay. First of all, I don't know Dr. Marx, and we didn't coordinate these talks, but I couldn't think of a better way to frame some of the stuff I'm going to talk about than to review the DSM criteria. So I want to thank Dr. Marx. I also want to take a little bit of time just to thank the organizers for inviting me and for really putting together a world-class group of scholars here, in addition to folks like Yuval Neria yesterday and Adam Brown and others. My pal and co-conspirator at times, Yinka Kinsler-Smith, is on the docket for today. Heidi Ellis, who's fantastic in our field. And then, of course, MacArthur Genius Award winner, I believe, Betsy Levy-Palak is coming up later today. So if you haven't been on the whole conference, I'd encourage you to make sure you stick around for today. It's been an excellent, excellent group to date. I'm going to take some of the things that that really, this presentation takes some of the things that Dr. Marx talked about, and actually with regard to the heterogeneity of the presentation of PTSD, something we call polythetism, which is the heterogeneous presentation of a diagnosis. And I'm going to actually blow it up a little more, even though, as Dr. Marx said, there are over 600,000 presentations of PTSD just using the symptom criteria available in the diagnostic classification scheme that we use here in North America and is used in Europe and other places. I'm going to talk about how we think about the impacts of trauma on human behavior in terms of psychopathology, if you will, across or between cultures. I'm going to be presenting some stuff from actually a study that's a few years old now. It's published in 2014, but I think it's still relevant. It probably needs to be updated, and I encourage anybody who's listening to please, take me up on that and update it. In any case, so my work has focused on displaced populations and immigrant groups. And as you see here, this is the sort of latest good data we have on populations of concern to the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. As you can see that the majority are not in the same parts of the world where our diagnostic classification scheme that's codified in DSM, where that was developed. I mean, 14% are living in Europe. You might argue that the 18% in the Americas are also, sort of culturally consistent in many of them anyway with some of the DSM cultures, but clearly the vast majority is not. And so I think this issue of cultural relevance of DSM disorders is especially important for those who work with displaced populations. The main problem here is the risk of committing what Arthur Kleinman calls the category fallacy. You can read that faster than I can read it to you, but it's essentially the way that we as mental health professionals and mental health researchers can take a diagnostic category derived from one cultural tradition, European, North American traditions, and then impose it and go look for it elsewhere. We can usually find it elsewhere, and there are multiple publications showing that if you give someone a measure of PTSD, they will endorse, and they're trauma affective, a certain proportion of them, a small minority of those who've been trauma exposed, certainly consistent with what Dr. Marx said just now and what some people like Adam Brown said yesterday. A small minority will endorse quite a few of those symptoms. Does that mean that this is the right way to think about their disorder? Does it mean that you as a clinician have the right questions to ask them to get at their distress? What myself, Amy Jocelyn, who is out of one of the Australian, very productive Australian PTSD research groups, and Eva Keatley, who's eventually went on to get her Ph.D. in neuropsychology. What we did a few years ago was we looked at a whole bunch of disorders defined in the psychiatric anthropological literature to see how they fit. We coded them based on PTSD symptoms, which Dr. Marx very ably gave you a whole list of those just now, so I don't have to go over those. But also we looked at depression symptoms because we know that depression has a high comorbidity with PTSD. And then we also, because our read through of this anthropological literature found that that there were actually some psychotic symptoms reported as well. So we included that as well. And we coded all these things, what exists in the anthropological literature surrounding things that we would diagnose as mental health problems that occur in trauma-affected populations outside of North America and Europe. Okay, what are we really looking for? We are essentially questioning this debate. There's a debate in the literature which on the one side says that PTSD is a universal diagnosis. Those anthropologists out there will understand this as an etic argument. And then there's another side of the debate where PTSD is completely North American and European, and we shouldn't be even talking about it at all when we leave North America and European societies. And some would argue even when we look at ethnic minority groups within North America and Europe. Okay, we expected that that the picture was a little bit different than just the sort of bipolar debate. We expected to find, this is our hypothesis, that trauma-related cultural constructs of distress, and when we talk about cultural constructs of distress, we're talking about ideas around distress that are defined within particular cultural groups. We expected that there would be quite a bit of overlap between a number of trauma-related cultural constructs of distress and PTSD. We didn't really think that it was going to be this bipolar. We wanted to know the degree to which we could measure this, or which this existed. So I'm not going to go through the measures and the methods. I'm going to paste a link to the article that you can look at. Suffice it to say, there is other work being done currently around this issue by a whole bunch of people now, which is exciting to see. And there has been good work in the past prior to this publication as well. Here are some examples of stuff that you find out there when you look into the psychiatric anthropology literature, also called cultural psychology or cultural clinical psychology. You find quite a few cultural constructs of distress. Sorry, that's my alarm saying I'm over time. That have some which look a lot or sound a lot like something that you would expect in PTSD, like if you look at Masilango in Gambia, extreme fear. Some of the things, or saisissement prégnant in Haiti, startled with loss of self-control. One might, as a clinician, one might say, okay, that might fit very well into PTSD. Others, you need more explanation, right? Jiarhoon in Afghanistan, which my pal Ken Miller has done some work around, is a bloody liver or liver blood. What does that mean? So, but when you ask further questions about this, you can find out how people think about distress. In the anthropological literature, there's quite good descriptions of these things. And what we did with these was we coded each for the type of symptoms that we thought might exist here. And we found that there were really 4 different groups of trauma-related disorders out there in the cultural concept of distress literature. And we tried to put them in ways that European and North American, these groups, European and North American psychologists and psychiatrists and social workers would be familiar with. So a somatic dysphoria, this sort of feeling bad focused on your body. Behavioral disturbance, some antisocial stuff, some anger, but also a lot of hyperarousal. And anxious dysphoria, which is not so different from some of the things you find in the PTSD literature in terms of a factor of PTSD, a dimension of PTSD, but doesn't at all encompass the whole of PTSD. And then we found something that looked a lot like what we think of as depression. So when we think of these sort of trauma-related problems that other cultures, at least other cultures identified through anthropology, discuss when they talk about problems, these were the sort of 4 types of things. Note that none of them is completely encompassed by PTSD. So we did find support for this overlap. In fact, I would argue that we found support for something a little more overlapping, but we need to even expand the disorders that we're interested in within the DSM. So one of the things that Yuval Neria said yesterday was that there are multiple disorders where trauma, although not conceptualized as central to the disorder, is often an historical piece of a person's experience. So things like some personality disorders have that. So often it's an exacerbating stressor or an exacerbating piece of it. I'm over time a little bit, but I'm excited to hear what people have to say for questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rasmussen. That was very interesting. You raised some really important insights about cross-cultural differences related to the nature of trauma exposure and differences in clinical presentations post-exposure, including with regards to dimensions of clinical comorbidities and aspects of these presentations. Perhaps we need to think a little bit more about our research methods such as the use of inductive, qualitative, and mixed methods approaches, to building culturally specific frameworks for PTSD and trauma symptomatology. So maybe during the discussion, we can speak more to pragmatic approaches to culturally specific theory building. So thank you very much. Now I'll turn it over to our last speaker, Dr. Vinck, for his remarks.
And I managed to unmute myself, and I assume you're able to see me. I tend to prefer personal direct face-to-face contact or interaction, so I did not prepare slides, but rather wanted to build a little bit on what the other speakers have mentioned, but also really kind of focus my presentation today is on what's happening down the line. So first, as a general introduction, my name is Patrick Vinck. I'm heading a program on peace and human rights data. And really what it comes down to is trying to understand the effects of violence and conflict and how people want to see the rebuilding process happen. So we ask questions like very open-ended questions like, what do you think should be done to rebuild a more peaceful society? I mean, we phrase those questions and very much use mixed methods studies to engage into dialogue around, again, the past, what people have experienced, how it's impacting them in their daily lives today, what implication it has for their social relations, for their engagement in society, and then how did they view the future? What do they think needs to happen to build peace? So it looks like I'll try to speak a little louder and come a little closer. I hear you can hear me better now. So I'll make my remarks focused on 5 areas of studies. Now it sounds like a lot, and that's part of my problem is I have too many interests and focus, but I'll briefly talk about those 5 areas of studies and draw implication for 3 aspects: for the measurement of trauma, what has been discussed, for what I guess we can call trauma sensitive programming, and for some of the major gaps that exist in the research in this area. So again, part of what we do is trying to understand the relation and the effects of violence in people's day-to-day activities. And so when in the title of this specific panel about behavior, the behavior of interest we are talking about are things like perception about peace, perception about justice. But let me start with one behavior, which is around settlement choice. Where do people decide to live? How does that impact them? And what's the dynamic there? Very recently, we did a research in Iraq where we engaged with displaced population in both in camps and out of camps. And we see that that settlement has an impact on their mental health, has some implication. But I want to draw here into a much earlier study that we did in northern Uganda. I worked there for many, many years, and we did a number of research between 2005 and 2010. And we measured distress. We used a validated and existing instrument measuring PTSD and depression in the same population over time. Now, it's not a true panel study, but it's about the same community. And in 2005, we found 71% showed or met the criteria for symptoms of PTSD. In 2007, that percentage was down to 55%. In 2010, that percentage was down to 34%. And when we look at depression, in 2005, 49% met the criteria for symptoms of depression. In 2007, it was down to 37%. And in 2010, it was down to 18%. Now, PTSD doesn't go away by itself. And yet, at population level, we see this major decrease in what is measured as symptoms of PTSD. And so what we're really doing here is measuring some other acute response to the violence, because what has happened between 2005 and 2010 is that in 2005, you have very much ongoing violence. Conflict is happening. In 2007, you have a peace negotiation that is underway. There's no more violence, no more active violence, but the Lord's Resistance Army, the group committing or perpetrating the violence, is still there, but is in a peace negotiation process. And by 2010, the peace negotiation process has collapsed, but the Lord's Resistance Army is no longer present in northern Uganda. They've moved to southern Sudan and other areas of the Central African Republic and the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And in the meantime, what has happened is that people have started going back home. People have started resuming their livelihood, farming. And so what we see is that there is really a connection between what we see as this acute response to trauma and being able to resume your life. And it doesn't mean that there's not a need for psychosocial interventions, for example, but it does show that maybe the acute reaction we're measuring is not necessarily a long-term stress. Let's just go it that way. So again, the implication here is on terms of what are we measuring, but also what is the relation between trauma and settlement and environment and your livelihood. The second study I just want to mention here is really what originated our work with Fong and other colleagues, which was originally to look at our outcome of interest as being around peace. In other words, peace and justice. In other words, what is the attitudes towards peace? What is the attitudes towards justice? Are people wanting more revenge? Are people more forgiving? What shapes that kind of behavior, and what implication does it have for peace building? And so, of course, we looked at other factors, but trauma keeps coming as an important factor. And we see that it does shape whether people hold more negative attitudes towards peace. And what I mean by that is peace can only be achieved by killing all the rebels, for example. I'm very caricatural here, but you can see how that comes into play. And one interesting finding in northern Uganda, again, is that the definition of peace is not different based on trauma. Whether you show symptoms of depression or show symptoms of PTSD or not, your definition of peace is the same, but how you think peace can be achieved is different. You support different mechanisms, typically more retributive, more oriented towards, let's call them negative means to achieve peace. And just to draw more specific examples here is around memorials. Now, in the areas of peace building, the idea that memorials are a good idea is commonly accepted. The idea that you need to recognize what people have experienced and build some forms of recognition of that experience is good. But once we start analyzing it, we see that obviously the more you've experienced violence, the more you're likely to support memorials. It's recognized you as in your experience, and so it seems that it's logical. But on the other hand, the more you show mental health issues, the more you show trauma, again, as expressed, for example, through symptoms of PTSD or depression, the less you're likely to support memorials. And that makes sense because you don't want to see something that reminds you on a daily basis of your experience. And so you have here now a tension between what is a valuable recognition and yet at the same time a re-traumatizing potential intervention. And so the implication here is for what I was mentioning as trauma-sensitive programming. In other words, memorials might be a good idea, but only if they are accompanied by other measures that help people who may have trauma and things like PTSD or depression, for example. The other area we are looking at now is around a post-traumatic growth theory. Now, there's this theory in political science that as you are exposed to violence, it leads to some kind of cathartic effect and you become more engaged in society. You're more likely to vote. You're more likely to be engaged in association, in civic life in your society as a result of your experience. And when we look at the evidence for this in cross-cultural studies, we've now collected, I don't know how many surveys we've done, but it's over 200,000 interviews in almost 20 countries. And what we see is, well, as researchers like to say, it's not that simple. And we see that, well, yes, in some cases, we see something that match what the theory is, this post-traumatic growth theory, but in other places, it doesn't work. So how do we start to unpack that? How do we start to, is it about the forms of trauma? Is it about the nature of the conflict around the settings in which the violence is explaining and is being experienced? And so that points to the third implication, which is these major gaps that are still existing in our understanding of the implication of trauma is really, really limited. And I'll point to two more areas of studies of ours where this shows is more recently in Eastern Democratic Republic of the Congo, as many of you are probably aware, there was a major Ebola outbreak. And attitudes or perception towards or behavior in terms of adopting protective behaviors was a big issue. And it was a big issue because there was large mistrust in the actors that are promoting those behaviors. Mistrust in the government, mistrust in international NGOs, mistrust in the United Nations that made people not only not adopt protective behaviors, but at times even fueling rumors and things like that. And we see here that, again, the legacy of the past, and by legacy of the past, I mean both the violence that people have experienced, the sense of betrayal, the sense of lack of assistance, and the trauma play a major role in fueling that distrust. And that too is an area where there are major gaps in research. And the last example I will give is our research on more intergenerational transmission. And I leave transmission blank because we started by transmission of history. What we were really interested in was, how do people talk about their experience to the next generation? And that was really emerging from our research in Cambodia, where when a special tribunal was set up to judge crimes committed 30 years ago by the Khmer Rouge, we realized that the older generation had really rarely talked to the younger generation about their experience. There was a sort of silence around that experience, to the point that the younger generation could not even believe that that was true, that the kind of events that were now being talked about really happened. But at the same time, we had many people in the younger generation defining themselves as victims. They did not live under the Khmer Rouge. They did not experience directly the forms of violence that were outlined before. And yet we see that they define themselves as victims. And many of them would show, of course, there's a range of other events and other exposure, but many of them would show, adjusting for their own experience, some relation with what their parents had experienced. And we also realized that there's actually very little evidence around trying to understand what is the effect of trauma on parental strategy, on your behavior towards your children. Now, there's a lot of Western-based studies. There's a lot of studies among former soldiers and things like that, but very little from a perspective of a general population who has experienced violence. So again, I'll just summarize and stop here, but across all these areas of studies that we are interested in, we see trauma as being a key factors, and yet we're still facing and experiencing challenges when it comes to the measurement itself, when it comes then to the implication and really advocating for trauma-sensitive programming, and finally, when it comes to identifying and trying to fill what seems to be really major gaps. I mean, education is something we've been doing forever, right? Every parent teaches their children to somehow, and yet we really have major issues in understanding how the legacy of the past affects parents' behavior. I'll stop here. I know it's a little bit disconnected from the previous talks, but hopefully we can tie it all together in the discussion. And again, I want to echo my previous panelists in thanking the organizer. Thank you to the participant. It's been a fascinating experience so far, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Vinck, for speaking about real specifics in the current research, and also raising future directions in these areas of peace building and trauma-sensitive programming cross-culturally. So moving on to the discussion portion of the panel, I will ask a first question to begin the conversation, but I hope that audience members will also engage by adding their own questions and insights into the chat, as they've already been doing. Thank you very much for that. So to start us off, to build continuity and synthesize from each of these talks, I want to ask more specifically about cultural factors. Perhaps I can first kick it over to Dr. Rasmussen. But I'd like to speak more to how do cultural factors interact specifically with clinical service delivery to populations impacted by violence, displacements, and other traumatic event exposure? And how can researchers and clinicians from academic contexts enhance cultural sensitivity, cultural humility, and cultural specificity when working with populations exposed to traumatic events?
Okay, that's a big question.
Big question, many yards long, so take it as it comes.
I'll try and give a sort of cogent answer. First of all, I think that when clinicians are working with individuals who are particularly sort of far out of their cultural background, sort of far out from the culture and the culture of mental health and of the DSM, we need to think about how culture impacts both the questions we ask and the responses that are given. So the questions we ask is I think the type of literature that we reviewed for the project that I described is where I would go first to figure out what are the right questions. And that literature exists out there. It's not hidden away somewhere. It's not completely, absent. There's not a whole lot of it, but it is out there. If you are somebody from the U.S. who's going to be working in, I don't know, Indonesia, then you need to be familiar with how what's out there in terms of the ways that people think about stress and distress in Indonesia, right? The other side is the sort of response side, which is how do people respond to questions? Are they people who are there cultures of agreeing with people who ask you questions as just a matter of course, or is there a culture of responses that are more extreme? So I'll give you an example. When I worked with in Bellevue Hospital, there was a clinic that works with a lot of refugees, and we had a lot of Tibetan refugees who came through our doors, as my friend and colleague Yinka Kinsley-Smith will recall, and almost none of them met criteria for PTSD. Why was that? Was because their responses to questions were in the, well, I had a little bit of this distress, never a whole lot of this distress, right? Their expressions were not particularly reflective of what we'd think of as particularly severe symptoms. However, when you talk to them more qualitatively, they could tell you that they're having a lot of distress. It wasn't a severe expression of distress, but that's probably related to culturally related response styles. So that's, I think, how culture affects it. It affects the type of questions that we should be asking, and it affects the types of responses that people give when you ask those questions.
Thank you so much. If another panelist wants to jump in, they can. Otherwise, I might ask a second question that has come up. Okay, so this one is a little bit more geared maybe to Dr. Marx. In the US, kind of speaking from a clinical psychology, potentially DSM-based framework, which we've really questioned throughout the 2 days of this conference. But we do have treatments for trauma and PTSD that have been developed via clinical trials in lab-based academic settings that have good efficacy. So during the conference, we've talked about both some meaningful limitations of applying these treatments in fieldwork settings, and yet there also might be some degree of translational value in drawing from treatments that have been developed by the use of RCTs and other clinical research methods. So I was wondering if Dr. Marx could speak a little bit to this and potentially bridge the gap a little bit, because I think this is a question that we've been sort of skirting around a little bit throughout the last 2 days.
Yeah, thank you. And it's a really good question. So, I will just say a couple of things about this. First of all, you are all right to question the definition of PTSD. And in fact, right now, there are two official definitions of PTSD. There is the DSM definition, and then there's the ICD-11 definition, okay? And they differ considerably. The ICD definition is only comprised of 6 symptoms, 6 core symptoms versus 20 that's in the DSM-5. I see this as a very important question for the field. And we still have yet to define in a way that has broad consensus what is PTSD. And I saw that there was a question in the chat about the definition of PTSD and do we not treat people who don't have it? To be clear, we definitely should treat people that are trauma survivors who don't necessarily meet all of the criteria for PTSD. The treatments that we have do work for those who don't quite meet the definition of PTSD, and there's a lot of good work to suggest that those who are suffering from the sequelae or the fallout of trauma but don't meet the criteria do suffer in very serious ways and very comparable ways to those who do meet PTSD definition. As far as sort of the translation, I will say this, that this is an emerging area in the field. There has been some work taking what we know, taking some of these evidence-based treatments that were developed here in the United States and testing them around the world with folks who don't speak English and have never had any access to modern psychiatry or anything like that. There's been work that's been done in the Congo, in Africa more broadly. There's been work that's been done in Asia. And other places around the world to really see if these treatments do apply and can be used and are helpful. And in fact, there is plenty of evidence that they are helpful for folks in around the world. There is a treatment known as narrative exposure therapy, or NET, that was developed specifically to be used with refugees who are suffering from PTSD-like symptoms or other kinds of problems. And there are data that are widely available and papers that have been published on the use of NET with these groups of people, and it is effective. And so we know that we have treatments that do work, but to be clear that there is a lot more work that does need to happen from a global health perspective in terms of understanding PTSD and whether or not these concepts apply, as has been talked about already, but also how these interventions that we have developed and continue to develop, do they actually work in the same way, and are they just as efficacious for these different groups of people as they might be here in the United States or in North America more broadly?
That was such a thorough answer. Thank you so much.
Sure, pleasure.
We have from the audience sort of a follow-up dialogue building question, and one of the other panelists can take this, whoever feels most comfortable. So we have, but do these treatments that work for all groups, and do the results hold? So they're citing some previous literature that in refugee populations, most or some programs lose some of the clinical gains after 2 to 3 months without continued care. And then generally this is making me just think about, how long are our follow-up periods in these global interventions? How long are researchers and clinicians sort of staying to kind of continue follow-up clinical care? So whoever wants to maybe speak to that. Dr.
I'm happy to answer it, but I don't want to, I'm happy to defer as well.
Dr. Rasmussen, did you unmute, or am I overreading?
Again, I'm happy to defer. You know, do you want me to? I can take it if you like.
Yeah, go right ahead.
Okay, I would say first of all, I echo what Dr. Marx said. NET has shown that that you can reduce distress in populations that are well outside of the culture of DSM and ICD. I think what cross-cultural research does is, to me, is shows that first, as I try to present, there's a lot of overlap in what different cultures around the world consider psychological problems following trauma. And there's also, even within DSM cultures in the US, there's a lot of different symptoms in there, right? There are lots of different problems that people with trauma have. We can reduce some of them, a fair number of them, reduce the severity of some of those symptoms with the treatments we have. Now, are these outcomes lasting? I think that the question of, okay, what happens 6 months later, 12 months later, it's incredibly hard to do randomized control trials. And it's also incredibly hard to follow up with those people who've been through those control trials 6 months, a year, let alone what we'd expect, what we'd like our clinical outcomes to be, right? When I've treated people with using NET, and I've said, okay, I hope this person is still has these benefits 3 years later. There's no research, or that if there is, I haven't found it, that has follow-ups as 3 years. It's really hard to do that. That's not to say it shouldn't be done, but it's just really hard. If we accept that there is quite a bit of overlap between trauma-related constructs of distress and the trauma-related construct of distress that we talk the most about in North America and Europe, PTSD, then I think we should expect that a lot of the treatments we have that work for what we think of PTSD in the US and Europe should reduce distress elsewhere. That doesn't change the issue of, are we asking all of the right questions? Do we have all the right disorder there? If I could just piggyback on something that Dr. Vinck said, and then I'll shut up. One of the issues which I think comes to the fore when you work with displaced populations, particularly those living in IDP, internally displaced camps and refugee camps, is the question of when we measure PTSD, when we ask people about, or any distress for that matter, are we really asking about problems that are part of a disorder, or are people still in this incredibly stressful environment so that their problems are not disordered at all? They're very normal, right? We know from work in North America and Europe that immediately after a traumatic event, almost everybody who was exposed to that traumatic event has a lot of symptoms. Do they need treatment for those symptoms? Not everybody needs treatment for those symptoms, because if they live in a peaceful place, like I think of New York after 9/11, those of us who were around, remember, it wasn't exactly peaceful, but it wasn't like a war-torn area. There weren't continued attacks. But even after 9/11, about most people were much better about a month after that, or 2 months after that. A lot of people were better. Some people maintained problems. If we think about really stressful environments, maybe there's not the space for those things that happen naturally in most people after they experience a trauma to occur. And so what you're going to find is you're going to still find high levels of distress if you give them a measure of PTSD in northern Uganda when the situation is still stressful. It's not really post-traumatic stress disorder. It's sort of a stress disorder, maybe.
Well, I think that's right. And that was, kind of what I was going to say here, is that in many of these places, it's very hard, first of all, to get follow-up data. But second of all, if folks are still in these places and where they are still encountering considerable distress, and are in, continue to remain in chronic traumatic environments, if you will, then it's going to be hard for any treatment to work and work well under those kinds of conditions. And so I think that's exactly right. We assume that, that it's post-traumatic and that there's sort of like, there's nothing else that comes up for these folks. And that's not the case in, lots of places around the world. And it's often not the case for people here as well, that, folks, trauma, I will just say this, we know this from the literature, that trauma begets trauma. Folks don't get traumatized once in their lives. Usually when you ask people for their trauma histories, they will report multiple things happening over the span of their lives. And so that's a really important consideration in all of this.
Which exactly, I mean, I don't think you're saying anything different from what I said, which is exactly the challenge of what we are measuring is not something post-traumatic. Second, as you just noted, most contexts do not have do not return to a non-traumatic event. I mean, if you look at Eastern DRC or even Northern Uganda, the post-conflict situation remains a traumatic one. And so it points to, how do we change that? How do we, at the very least, consider trauma in programming around other intervention? And that's the example of the memorialization, for example. How do you approach that while considering trauma, while at the same time recognizing, and that's the limit of intervention specific to trauma, is when you have numbers like 71% showing some kind of stress response, how do you address that? And in the end, from a pragmatic perspective, we need to think, okay, what are the behaviors that are problematic? Let's just say that way, I don't know. But when we think about police building, what are those behaviors? What are these effects of trauma that likely or potentially are going to create problem to rebuild society? And so I think there's really need to be more of a dialogue in terms of clinical psychology and the response to trauma, and then its implication for peace building, which is still lacking, and it's something we started 20 years ago, and yet there's still probably not enough of that discussion happening.
Thank you. This was really a rich dialogue. I feel like we went right into the heart of this issue, and I think on day 2 we were all ready for it, and it's very helpful. I've been given permission for like a 2 more minute buffer. I just want to end with Dr. Vinck, you spoke to this a little bit, but if any of the panelists want to just speak to what maybe 1 or 2 of the pressing questions and future directions are for this area, what might we want to be asking in some future research, given everything, the state of the literature and everything we've talked about today?
Who would you like to go first?
I'll just note, and I think I mentioned it, but it's probably a biased one, but I would say children. And I do think that anything that deal with the intergenerational dimension and thinking about future generation and how they will deal with trauma and past experience is critical. And as I noted, I think there is surprisingly big gaps in how we look at education, how we look at transmission of history and narrative in this space. Make it short. There are many other areas.
There are lots of areas. I would love to see more things around which this conference is organized, really. I think there are important psychological implications, as I think was implied by some of the things that Dr. Marx was saying, of security and peace, right? As Dr. Vinck was saying. I would love to see research showing the effect on things like trauma and distress on changing political environments, on making environments more secure. It's an obvious point, perhaps, but we don't yet have a whole lot of research showing that those direct effects.
And I'll just add that two things that I think global health with respect to trauma exposure and PTSD is really in its nascent stage, and we really do need to do a lot better and a lot more work. The other thing that is garnering a lot of attention right now is something that is called precision medicine, which is understanding, as I alluded to earlier, is understanding how to treat the individual. And understanding what works for whom under what conditions. And so that's a very big question. It's only also in the beginning stages, but it's a very important aspect of understanding how we can best address all of the problems that lots of different people face.
Thank you so much. Those were all great answers, and I'm really looking forward to all of this future research, right, that we're all just going to get on as soon as possible. So we can continue the current conversation in a breakout room that Justine is going to create for us if we want to. And thank you again to all of the panelists for sharing your research, and to all of the audience members for your engaging questions and insights. I'm looking forward to the talks for the rest of the day. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, so if you